Hey everyone, good evening. It's good to see you on this Tuesday night. So glad that you're with us. And we have Jeff Davis from Arizona State University. In for an awesome presentation tonight. But Miss Wendy, she's on the road and wanted me to tell you that she's going to be sending out a book study, your Google Classroom information, and your Nashville information a little later this week. So if you've been looking for that, just continue to watch out for that. She'll be sending that out to you. So book study, Google Classroom, and Nashville information will be coming to you via email later on this week. So I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm going to hush and I'm going to turn everything over to Jeff Davis. Jeff, we're so glad you can be with us tonight.
I'm so happy to be here again. Thanks all, and Liz sends her regards as well. So I'm sure you'll see her again sometime soon. But she's out of office this week, and so I'm flying solo today. I've dropped a handout in the chat if you want to grab that. It's going to have some helpful links. I'll put it in again in a few minutes just as we make sure everybody gets in. But tonight we get to talk about something that is that I'm very passionate about, that our center is very passionate about, that our boss at the center, Professor Sean Beinberg, is very passionate about. We're going to be talking about state government and some of the stories that shape what our states look like and how they operate in their government. So, can everybody see the presentation? Okay, did that show up on the Zoom? Okay, great. So I want to start with this, that a lot of times when we get to the point where, so I was a government teacher for high school seniors. That was one of the main things that I did in my years in the classroom. And by the time students got to me, it was like uh, for the way that we did it in Arizona back in the old days, like 10, 20 years ago when I was in the classroom. Um, didn't do a lot of talk about state government or the structures of even the federal government, all the way up until they were seniors. That was kind of just left to be like a one semester course they would do as seniors. So to the extent that we would teach anything about federalism or how we divide national and state powers, it'd be done with a diagram like this. I know I used something like this when I was teaching government to high school seniors even, right? And and so we give them this Venn diagram, and it would say, okay, we have these enumerated powers that the national government, the federal government in Washington, D.C. has. And these are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And we have a few examples of that here. And then we have this right side, which says reserve powers for the state government as laid out by the 10th Amendment. And it's got this list of powers there. And you can search for diagrams of federal and state powers on the internet and find a billion, diagrams that look a whole lot like this. Okay. Um, but there's a couple of real issues with like some of the misrepresentation that's kind of going on with this chart. Do any of you want to take a stab at like what I might be getting at, like what might be misrepresented by this chart? And there could be many things. So I'm not saying there's only one correct answer, but I'm just curious if any of you are seeing the same thing that I do when you look at this chart. What might be a little misleading or might drive students towards some misunderstanding when they look at this chart? You can unmute, you can type it in the chat. Just curious if anybody's got any thoughts on that. Okay.
I think we have
In,
more overlap than what is there.
okay.
Um, education is talked about at the federal government level every day.
Certainly,
So
certainly. Yep.
it's not, it's not just delegated to the states. There are, the federal government does influence education.
Yes. And primarily through lots and lots of strings they've attached to things, right? Whereas we would say it's not in the purview of the federal government to control education. It just isn't, not constitutionally at least. But they've got a whole lot of dollars and they dangle them in front of states and they attach conditions to receiving those dollars. And that that creates quite a bit of significant control there. And then there's the other things like, civil rights protections that the federal government's going to do, and that has an impact on education. Schools need to be adhering to those federal civil rights protections. So that's certainly true as well. Whether we're talking about, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, whether we're talking about, racial equality and equity, like all of that plays a role as well. But yeah, certainly there is those overlaps and that influence of the federal over state. There's one other big issue that I want to point out, if I may, which is that when we read the U.S. Constitution, the powers that are listed for the federal government, there's a total of 18 of them, and they are meaningful. They're significant. 18 powers that are like coining money, declaring war, regulating commerce, across state lines and with international trade partners, establishing post offices. Like there are a number of significant ones, some of them that are shown on that chart I just showed. But to point out what the 10th Amendment says here, it says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So just to highlight like what we're talking about for what the states get to do is all of the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. And the point I'd like to draw to your attention, and I hope you draw to your students' attention too, is that is a lot of powers. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution is a tremendous number of powers. So, sometimes we create these charts and we make this kind of deliberate attempt to show a balance of this list for the federal and this list for the states. Because I don't know if it just visually seems to make sense to show that. But the reality is if you're trying to list the powers of a state government, you're going to be doing it for a good long while because states are in charge of a lot. And sometimes we're just, not thinking of it all that much for a variety of reasons. So I just want to point out a few things when we're thinking about states. States decide the conditions under which we are born. States can determine rules on reproductive rights or lack thereof. They can do hospital maternity regulation for safety. They license the professionals that are going to deliver the babies in the hospitals, and on and on and on. You can go into all kinds of stuff. These are just some quick examples. They decide the conditions under which you're educated. We know that the federal government has a lot to say about, core equity and civil rights issues. We know they intervene with some, funding strings they put in front of the states. They establish, school lunch programs. Like we know the feds do those kinds of things. Apart from that, the states are establishing basically everything related to public education in state universities. How are the schools getting funded? How are the teachers getting certified? What are they teaching in the schools? What do students have to do to graduate? Like on and on and on you go, right? They decide the conditions under which you work, right? We have federal minimum standards for equity, wages, and safety set by various federal agencies or by Congress. But then everything else that's to get regulated between your relationship with your employer and you is done by the state. All the contract laws and everything, like all the union regulations and what unions can or cannot do. So they decide even personal life, they decide conditions under which you marry and divorce. Marriage and divorce licenses, the conditions under which you can get a marriage or a divorce are all done by the states. All the property decisions that happen in the before and after a marriage or divorce, that's all set by states. Child custody laws, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? If you start, expand, or close a business, your state is regulating all of that. When you die, even the states are regulating, what are the laws around hospice, treating terminal illnesses, cemeteries, body donation. States do all of that, right? So to try to like, I think that there needs to be a little more done by us as educators to make sure that our students are aware of of what their state government is capable of doing and how it works as a result, right? Because like that's a huge list of things that touch a lot more of what we consider like the important things in life than some of those things that are listed with the federal government. Like, war is a very big deal. Coining money is a very big deal. And we know the federal government does kind of, poke its hands into some of these other issues, like you guys pointed out. But but the states are doing a ton, and we need to address that. So uh, my boss here, our boss at the Center for American Civics, is Professor Sean Beinberg. He actually just wrote a book that's called Progressive States' Rights, in which he talks about uh, how fascinating it is that we have this mindset today of states' rights being kind of a core issue of more often Republicans or conservative people. But the funny thing is that back in the 1910s and 20s, when Republicans had consistent control of government for a very, very long period of time, it was often Democrat governors and Democrats in state legislatures that were complaining about the lack of states' rights and demanding for more local control in states' rights, protected from the federal government to do all kinds of progressive agenda things that they wanted to do. And so just a fascinating kind of story. And I know this issue is near and dear to his heart, of just like what states are really capable of, like, does matter. And we're in a place right now where the instruction in federalism is changed quite a bit. So here's the question: what is the state? And I should say, no pun intended. What is the state of instruction in federalism today? When you guys are trying to teach about Kentucky, whether it's Kentucky's history or whether it's Kentucky's structure of government, how is that going? What are the successes, or are there any challenges that you're facing? Like, what are the big challenges that you face in trying to teach about federalism and Kentucky in particular? I'd just like to hear from any of you who'd like to contribute. And I'll put the handout in the chat one more time while you guys are thinking about responding. Let's see. Just for those of you who came in later. Okay, there's the handout. Any of you have any challenges or difficulties or success stories for, like, how you go about teaching about Kentucky history and Kentucky government?
Sometimes think it's harder for us to teach about state government because kids aren't as familiar with it. And, they're seeing things about national news all the time, whereas maybe not state issues.
Yep. Yep.
So I think that that's probably the most difficult part.
That's you made a really great observation there. Like, when you think about the media environment that our kids are coming up in, um, local, for one thing, like, local news ain't what it used to be. Local news at one point 30 years ago genuinely would be covering state government and would have been watched by more people as well. The nature of changes in technology have made it to where, to the extent that anybody's watching any news, it's probably national news, like carried by 24-hour cable networks that are trying to appeal to a broad national audience, right? Or YouTubers who are trying to get, a big audience, TikTokers or whatever, trying to get as big an audience across the country as they can get, right? So yeah, the media environment that they're coming up in is not talking to them about states the way that maybe it would have 30, 40, 50 years ago. And even then, like, their exposure probably would have been pretty limited. So yeah, great point. And by the way, local news conglomerates are often, parts of conglomerates. They're actually not all that local. They're often owned by giant affiliates who are feeding out a lot of the same content to every station in the country, because that's how they make a big profit. Make one piece of content, turn it out to all the stations they own across the country, and then you don't have to spend as much on local production. So yeah, local TV networks are not really covering all that much. You mentioned newspapers. I see D. You mentioned newspapers in the in the chat here. Yeah, newspapers are, I hate to say it, but largely gone from consumption compared to where they were decades ago. Like, do they still exist? They still do digital print forms and stuff. Yeah, they're still out there. They're not being consumed at the levels that they used to be, and they're not relied on the way that the public used to, for sure. And so you don't have a local basis as much to have that kind of reporting being done and talked about in the news. So yeah, everything's digital. Uh, Conversations with grandparents to start happening today with these students. That's a great point too. Yeah. So and it can be really tough to have like we're getting to a place now where we're having a political conversation is feels a little dangerous and maybe it's better to just avoid it altogether rather than risk offending somebody, right, or getting into a fight with somebody. So people don't talk about it as much, then people don't know about it as much, right? um yeah, Sarah, you think teaching Kentucky history and governance almost gone away? That's very interesting. I'd love to hear more about why you think that, if you wouldn't mind telling us, or either
No,
unmuting
I
or
don't
putting it
care
in the
to.
chat.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't care to share. I
That's okay.
very much have taught fourth grade for 10 years,
Mhm.
and we taught a lot of Kentucky history in fourth grade. We actually even had fourth grade Kentucky textbooks, and I've been back and forth between fourth grade and fifth grade, and
Mhm.
it's supposed to, I think Kentucky is fourth grade content in the standards, and by the time those kids get to fifth grade, it just seems like it's not really that important as much as it
Mhm.
used to be, and
Okay.
and covered as well as it used to be.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Interesting there. Yeah, I think we're touching on a lot of the most central things, like the media environment. Um, the challenge that I faced big time was resources, like sourcing, like where to get things to do the teaching, because um, our district had these very, our state had these very rigid policies about textbook adoption and like what kinds of resources be allowed, trying to kind of control, to make sure that nothing too controversial got into classrooms, so to speak, right? This is kind of the environment I was in. So you've got this very restrictive adoption process for textbooks and resources. Well, Pearson can navigate that, right? McGraw-Hill, like the big textbook companies, like they can navigate that and they can put their resources in front of these adoption committees and then and get them accepted. But the local state history professor at ASU who wrote a book that's been used as a college textbook, like if he's going to collaborate with some local group, like they might not have the resources to actually get into those textbook adoption process and get accepted. Uh, so so oftentimes there's like just a bigger monetary incentive, a bigger kind of economic imperative to generate stuff that can sell anywhere in the United States, and things don't get designed and customized like for individual states, unless you can. Yeah, this is I love the points that you guys are making in here you know, uh, with kind of the social studies kind of being set aside compared to other subjects. Like, yeah, there is something to that. Yeah. Um, Excellent. Okay. So yeah, resources, media environment, like there's all kinds of challenges to it, right? So um, as we say that, like our students could be missing out on something really exciting and really rich if we can find ways to teach about the great stories that make our state unique, the things that make our state not so unique, and where we kind of fit into the national story along with other states, and then how our state government works, and teach them that's an access point as well. Um, so just before I move on to talking about this map and geographic considerations and stuff, um, just as one more point on state government, um, I don't know. This might be a fun exercise to actually do live with your classes. This could be a lot of fun. Um, Try one day, just like in class, like saying like we're going to call the president of the United States. We're gonna guys. We care about this issue of, you just name an issue. Who cares what it is, right? Just pick an issue and say we need to call the president and register our opinion as a citizen, right? And like put your cell phone on speaker, call the White House, and see if you can actually get a person on the line. There is a White House number, and just find it, and just see if anybody will talk to you, right? And if anybody happens to pick up the phone, be so daring to say something like, "We'd like to speak with the president," and just see what the receptionist on the other end says. I tried this one day in class because somebody told me I should do it. And I said, that sounds like fun, so we're going to do it. And we got a little chuckle out of the person. They were like, well, like I can transfer you to this message service and you can leave a message. And I said, well, will the president hear it? They said, well, somebody in the White House will hear it, and some of these messages will get selected for the president. It's like, okay, well, so we did that, uh, and we went down the line with a couple of other officials. Um, well, I had also attended some like local local government meetings. We have legislative districts in Arizona, and I'd recently gone to a legislative district meeting, and like, there's like 40 of us in the room total, and like 4 or 5 of them are elected public officials. Like I just showed up on a night that they had the scheduled meeting. I'm not anybody special. And so I just listened to the proceedings and I talked to a couple people, and like one of the state reps just gave me a cell phone number. And because like that's what they do. They're like there to be accessible to people. And so I just tried like, all right, well, we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna get our state representative. And I dial the phone and the phone rings. And then the guy on the other island just answers, Jeff, how you doing today? And I was like, hi, Representative Coleman. It's good to hear from you. And we just started chatting in front of the students for a second. The accessibility of your local state government compared to the federal government is kind of a remarkable thing. And it can take maybe even something like an object lesson like that to just present to students like, you can be heard as a citizen. Like, it might feel like you're insignificant, but your state and your local government are actually very much listening to you. And so just a fun exercise. Now, maybe you haven't been to a meeting of state reps and gotten anybody's cell phone number, though you probably could. But I bet you can, call the number or send an email even to the email address listed for one of your state reps for your schools, for the state rep in your school's area, and they would reply to you. They would almost definitely reply to you directly. It could be a fun exercise for you and the students one time. All right. So we know that the states are very different from one another. Some of that is a function of geography, right? You look at this map and you can just see like incredible differences between these places, right? Like just looking at the geography of a place like Kentucky compared to the geography of like Louisiana and compared to the geography of a place like Utah or Colorado, like just shows you some very, very stark differences. The natural features alone are going to change the lifestyles of people in the state, the priorities of the state government, and and maybe even the structure of the state government. That's going to be part of a state story. Part of a state story is going to be historical in nature. When did it become a state? When was its constitution drafted? What else was going on? What was the society and the culture like at the time of the drafting of that constitution? Those are things that shape what happens in states to a tremendous extent. So just to give you some samples of like what these kinds of comparisons can be like, you can do an exercise with your students where you send them to some databases. There's a great database called the Book of States that I have a link to on that handout, where it just lists a whole bunch of different statistics about state government and compares and contrasts them. And if you target your students toward a couple of sections, they might be able to find some easy things to fill out in a table to compare, like the total area, right? The land mass of various states, comparing the size of New Hampshire or Kentucky to, say, Texas, right? The population density, the total water area that's on the surface for the state. You'll notice that Arizona is a massive, massive state, 113,000 square miles, but less than 500 of them are have water on them. So, go figure. That's how we are, right? A little different than Kentucky, which is a considerably smaller state, but has more than twice as much water surface as Arizona does. That's going to change some things about priorities and lifestyles in states, right? What percent of the state land is used for agriculture? What's the incomes like for people in the state? Like, all these things can make pretty significant differences for policy considerations in states, and they give you some unique opportunities to look into those and explore them a little bit. So I'll show you one thing that I find very unique about Arizona. So unlike many states, especially in the East, Arizona's sort of new to the Union, right? We got added in 1912. And at the time that Arizona was added as a state, I shouldn't say when it was added as a state, when it was added as the U.S. territory, it was relatively unpopulated. There had been indigenous people who had lived in Arizona at various times. It had been a state of Mexico prior, but in each of these cases, like Native American tribes had largely left the state for various reasons in the 15 to 1600s, or been killed off by disease epidemics and other things with interacting with the Spaniards, violence and whatnot. And then same with Mexico. Mexico had this territory as a state, but didn't really, settle the land very much. There just weren't a lot of Mexican people in this land. There were some, certainly, but it was relatively small. So when Arizona was getting integrated as a territory in the Union, and there were settlers moving out to claim land in Arizona, it was still highly uninhabited. And as a result, when the federal government added Arizona as a state, it also protected tons and tons of state lands. So there's federal land that's protected as like national forests and national parks. There's tribal land that is established as reservations. That's all the purple spaces you see on that map there. There are state trust lands that are held by the state government and not developed unless the state decides sometime in the future to sell them for a need of state revenue. On and on it goes. Something like 80 or 85% of Arizona's total land is actually protected from development and cannot be purchased privately to build homes or shopping malls or businesses of any kind. That is a very different situation than, say, Texas, who was added into the Union quite a bit earlier than Arizona, and had a very different, land, relationship, because conservation just wasn't a priority to the national government at the time in 1830s when Texas was added. Active use of land was the priority, right? Tribal reservations were not a priority of the federal government at that time. They were still very actively in the mode of, in most cases, driving tribes out of lands and taking lands from them, unlike when Arizona was added, when suddenly there was a conscience about that and a desire to actually protect ancestral homelands for indigenous people. So those kinds of stories of what's going on in your state, like, dramatically change, things like what's actually available for you to purchase and develop today, in your state, here versus here. And Texas likes to brag about its cheap land. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, no kidding, you have cheap land in Texas because you have infinity land and none of it's protected for conservation of hardly any kind, other than those little green splotches you see dotted throughout there. So there's some interesting stuff like that. So let me talk you through a little bit of Arizona's history. I touched on a couple of things. And then I want to zoom over to Kentucky and see, like, what are some real fun and interesting highlights that your students might love to know. And I'm sure a lot of you teach many of these things already, but for anybody who's not so aware, like, it could be really useful. I certainly learned a lot, trying to put these things together. So for Arizona, we were a place that was inhabited by a lot of indigenous people: the Pueblo, the Hohokam, the Mogollon, and the Sinagua. They largely disappeared from the state in the 15th, 16th centuries. It was probably a result of spread of European diseases from exposure to Spanish, conquistadors and explorers, over time. That's probably what did it, but nobody's really all that sure. Small numbers of Mexicans settled it when it was part of Mexico as the state of Sonora. Then it was taken in the Mexican-American War. The U.S. claimed it as part of the territory in the Mexican cession, and it became part of the New Mexico territory. It got separately, broken apart from the New Mexico territory as a separate territory in 1863 and called Arizona, but still nobody came. Go figure, a place that has no water, nobody wants to come here. Until railroads arrived, like, it was largely unsettled. And then once somebody decided that you could find silver and copper in the hills of Arizona, all of a sudden people started coming here. And so our state was largely built around mining and growing of citrus and cattle ranching through 1912, when we became a state. That was kind of the basis of why people came to the state, was to get land and take mining jobs or do some citrus farming and things like that. So the context for our state's formation was in what is called the Progressive Era. And if you teach, big U.S. history at all, you might be familiar a little bit with the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was a time when sort of everybody was questioning the old ways of doing government. And it was all about, like, how do we get more democracy? How do we get more power for the people? there was this huge impulse to move off of just trusting elected representatives and judges and other government officials to just take care of governing for you, but to say like, no, put it in the hands of the people. So with that, Arizona drafted a very experimental constitution that infused a whole bunch of things that we now call direct democracy. Typical of states prior to this would have been, you get a vote, you're going to vote for your representative in your state house of representatives. Maybe you also vote for like a state senator, maybe you vote for your governor. And then those public officials will govern for the next 2 years or 4 years or whatever their terms are. Arizona created a bunch of mechanisms by which people, after electing representatives and governors and all these other officials, would also be able to write their own laws, put them on the ballot, and then pass them into existence without touching the government. Okay, or at least without going through the state legislature formally. So initiative, for example, initiative means citizens like me who don't have any, official status or role in public life other than just being a citizen of Arizona. I can download a form from the Secretary of State's website, fill it out with my proposed law, circulate a petition that I downloaded from the Secretary of State's website. And if I get enough Arizona voters to sign it, turn it into the office, they will put it on the ballot and the people of Arizona will vote for it to become law. And we can make laws and we can amend our state constitution without any government official ever saying whether we should or not. Okay. Referendum. Sometimes our state passes a new law, governor signs it, and then the people of Arizona say, not so fast. We actually don't want you to do that. Same thing. We sign a petition, we put it on the ballot, and we get to veto the governor's, signature, basically, or the legislature's passage of the bill. Recall. Sometimes we put a person in office and, they're in a 4-year term, and a year in, the people have decided they don't like this person anymore. Circulate a petition, put them back on the ballot, and remove them from office early. We've recalled a number of governors in Arizona through this process. And then it goes as far as judicial recall, right? This was one of the craziest things in the view of the federal government. Federal judges serve for life. They get appointed to the bench. They get confirmed by the Senate, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and then they stay there for life or until they choose to retire. In Arizona, every couple of years, their name's on a ballot and we say yes or no if they keep their jobs. So that era of direct democracy, that era of progressivism, deeply shaped our Constitution. And as a result, it has, continued to shape the culture of our state and the way that our Constitution just gets changed year after year by these citizen initiatives and things. Funny enough, President Taft, who was president at the time our state was getting accepted into the Union, when he received that copy of our state Constitution, he called it legalized terrorism and vetoed the admittance of Arizona as a state. So they sent this Constitution back to Arizona, and the drafting committee altered it to remove all the radical direct democracy provisions and make it like an ordinary looking, 3 branches of government elected by the people state government. Sent it back to the feds. It gets approved. They adopt Arizona as a new state. Taft signs off on it. And next thing you know, the state of Arizona is holding a bunch of legislative meetings and conventions to add all these provisions back into their constitution. And legislators were giving speeches about the amendments that were removed under oppressive coercion of President Taft, putting it all back in there. So we have all that stuff in our state constitution today. One of the most famous figures in our state history is a governor named George Hunt. He was the first governor of Arizona. So like George Washington, he was the first chief executive of our state, and he helped to draft our state's constitution. Unlike George Washington, he did not step down from power. And not only did he serve 7 terms as governor, he also, when he lost one of those elections, filed lawsuits and got allies of his in the Arizona Supreme Court to invalidate the election and reinstall him as our governor. That is a true story you can look up. And then upon his death, he had this mausoleum, this pyramid-looking mausoleum built in one of the finest state parks in Arizona. That's at Papago Park, overlooking the great city of Phoenix. He's got this like pyramid to himself. So interesting guy. So I love finding characters like that in my state history to bring to students and let them read some of the stories and anecdotes about him, or her, whatever fun character you can find, as like part of telling the story of like what's going on during the progressive era. So I would tell his stories, like when I'm talking about the adoption of Arizona as a state and the drafting of our state constitution. The conflicts between George Hunt and William Howard Taft were remarkable and noteworthy. And he's such a weird character that that it makes for some great stories. So good news is, like, I found that Kentucky's got some characters as well that are like very fascinating to study, and maybe you can incorporate some of these into yours. But um, please correct me on any of this where I'm incorrect, because I know a lot of you guys know Kentucky history way better than I do. But Kentucky's got a much more an older history with the United States. Its story goes on a little longer with the broader story of the United States than ours does in Arizona, simply because of the timeline of its acceptance as a state. But Kentucky also was inhabited by indigenous groups, the Mississippian and Fort Ancient cultures. Then French explorers encountered those tribal groups. They documented it. That's where we see the evidence of those pre-Columbian peoples and their ways of life. And then, of course, the French had their allies with certain tribal groups, and then they're turning their allies against other tribal groups, and there's conflict over over access to various resources in the region, and so you get the Beaver Wars. And between all that European colonial encroachment that happens over the 1600s and 1700s, plus the disease epidemics that came from encounters with the Europeans, largely tribes dispersed from Kentucky. They were depopulated, and they largely dispersed and reorganized further west, and resettled. European settlement goes through the 18th and continues into the early 19th century. And that continues this conflict with tribes, especially over access to traditional hunting grounds, because a lot of tribal groups had moved but continued to come back into Kentucky to where they used to hunt over many generations, right? So, and then I saw that we have this period where Kentucky is part of the United States but not a state, and there's no federal government as we know it today. What we had instead was the Articles of Confederation, and this somewhat national Congress that really didn't do a lot in terms of controlling states. So during this time, Kentucky is effectively a set of 3 counties of Virginia that are sort of called the Kentucky District, largely. And Kentuckians were seeking statehood and trying to break from Virginia and get kind of independent political recognition. But at the federal level, Congress, who gets to accept whether states join the Union or not, Congress was kind of distracted by the fact that the Articles of Confederation was falling apart, and they were trying to recreate a new national government. And so the argument was, well, we can't accept this state under the Articles of Confederation while we're still waiting to see if we're going to end up with a new system of government, because that would put Kentucky in a really weird, nether region of states. So they delayed ratification. Finally, it comes around, and Kentucky becomes the 15th state of the Union, right? So I found this very interesting, that Arizona's constitution was shaped during the progressive era, and because we were kind of a product of that period, all of the ideals of the progressive era were infused into our constitution with all that direct democracy. Kentucky's got a series of stories because Kentucky did not stick to one constitution. Kentucky has been shaped and reshaped by its historical circumstances as its constitution's been like redrafted on a few occasions. So in 1792, when Kentucky's drafting its first constitution, it basically copies the model of the new federal constitution. But unlike some states that are going to join the Union later, who came to trust the institutions that had been built by the new U.S. Constitution, there was a genuine skepticism about the model that the framers of the Constitution had built. And so that wondering of whether this was actually a proper model to follow or not led them to put a provision to reevaluate the Constitution by 1800 in the original Kentucky Constitution. Some interesting pieces to it. So 3 branches of government: that were nearly identical to the federal constitution, including an indirectly elected Senate. Not a lot of states did that. Most states would have, direct election of both houses of government. Kentucky decided to follow the federal model and have an indirectly elected state Senate. That would mean that representatives would vote for electors, and then the electors would choose the senators, as opposed to just voters choosing their own senators. So Kentucky led off with a Bill of Rights. That, I believe, is relatively unique in state constitutions too. A lot of states do not start with the state Bill of Rights, but Kentucky did choose to do that, probably in the wake of the debates around the federal Bill of Rights that were happening in 1792, as those were getting debated as amendments to the Constitution. So yeah, I think Kentucky is one of the only states I found, at least from this period, that chose to use that electoral college method to choose senators and the governor. So that was very fascinating. All right. And then we have that provision where they're going to be reevaluated by 1800. So then, as we were reevaluating the Constitution, Kentucky does, in fact, redraft a new Constitution in 1799. And as a product of that time period, we see a couple of things change. A lot of things stayed the same, but a couple of things did change. They abolished that electoral college provision and did add more directly elected offices, including an attorney general and a state treasurer. And then it also solidified a lot of the pro-slavery elements of the previous Constitution and also disenfranchised free blacks, mixed race persons, and Indians. That was certainly a product of its time and some of the conflicts that were starting to bubble about slavery and the status of people who had become free from slavery. There is another Constitution drafted in 1850, and this one is in the heat of some of the intense political battles that are starting to form around slavery. So it would be great, when you're teaching, U.S. history and the U.S. Civil War, and that pre-Civil War period, that antebellum period, to zero in on your state and look at what that conflict looked like in Kentucky and how that debate was playing out in the drafting of this new state constitution. So some changes were kind of in a more power to the people approach. They changed all state top executive officials to become popularly elected. Kentucky's joined the ranks of many states that kind of took that progressive step of not just. So at the federal level, right, we elect a president, and the president appoints everybody else in government: the attorney general, the treasurer, the secretary of state, so on and so forth. But a lot of states choose instead to let voters directly elect all those positions, and you can have people from different parties in all those various offices, like Kentucky does right now: Democratic governor, Republican attorney general, on it goes, right? The 1850 Constitution shifts judges to also become popularly elected, and at the same time restricts movement of slaves and their descendants and solidifies their status as largely property, or sort of serfs tied to the land and who they work for and where they work. And it also removes eligibility of ministers of religion to be able to run for public office. There was a perception that those religious ministers were sort of the most likely to be advocating anti-slavery positions, at least amongst the white population. And so there was under the guise of kind of a talk of separation of church and state, there was that restriction put in place, probably just to solidify the power of slaveholders in the state and preserve that institution. So there's some interesting things to talk about with the motives of like why those changes would have been made in 1850. What were the political conditions that would have led to those things happening, right? And then, of course, we get to Kentucky's current constitution, where the anti-slavery amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution have been passed. So there's now no more slavery. All persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States, deserving equal protection of the law, and all people have the right to vote regardless of race. The Kentucky State Constitution is obviously not compatible with those provisions, and so the new Constitution is drafted. And this is the first time that it was ratified through a citizen referendum. So interesting that in the progressive era, as we're seeing in the 1890s, that progressive mindset start to, play a big role in national politics. Kentucky and their constitution becomes somewhat of a product of that, saying like it's not good enough for just some delegates in a conference room to ratify a constitution. We need the citizens to say yes to it, right? And in addition, we've had so many drafts of the state constitution, it's had to be rewritten a few times, more than any other reason, because those state constitutions could not be amended unless they were, unless you just started over and just redrafted the constitution altogether. This constitution did create a process for amending itself. And so that reduced the need to hold, a convention and redraft the thing in its entirety. So now either house of the legislature can propose an amendment. 3/5 of both houses have to approve that proposed amendment. And then the voters of Kentucky get to vote yes or no at the next general election. And a majority vote ratifies it and adds it to the state constitution. That is close to what Arizona allows for. Arizona goes a little further in letting me as a citizen just do it without the legislature. But this is definitely kind of a similar product of that progressive kind of mindset of like citizen power to change government themselves, right? If anybody has any questions at any point, like interrupt me, type them in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm kind of flying through these things, but or if you want to sprinkle in some of your own details that you know about these moments of history that could be great to share with the other educators here, so they can look these things up and share them themselves. That'd be great. But so as I was looking through a lot of things in Kentucky history, the character that I was most fascinated by was William Gable. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Is it Gable? Does anybody know? William Gable. If anybody knows it's pronounced differently, let me know.
I think I pronounced it as Goble.
Goble. Okay. William Goble. Okay. If anybody else knows for certain, let me know, but I'll go with Goble. I'll trust your judgment on that. Thank you, Jessica. Wow. So I don't know if you know this, but you are the only state that has, I found this completely remarkable. You are the only state that has had a governor assassinated while in office. This is the only one. Never happened other than this one guy. And the story surrounding his assassination is fascinating. First of all, nobody's really sure who did it. There's no historical consensus on who the assassin was. There are a number of suspects, all of them very political and very politically connected, including the person who had recently lost the election for governor and was going to be leaving office, named Taylor. So just a fascinating story. He has, there's a disputed election. There are, lawsuits trying to be settled in court about who the next governor is going to be. Gable is not even the candidate for governor. Goble is not even the candidate for governor. Goble's is the lieutenant governor who would take office if the guy ahead of him dies or resigns. And Democrats are meeting in Louisville, Republicans in Frankfurt, or vice versa. I'm forgetting the exact details on this because neither one of them can agree to the processes being set in place for certifying the election results. And in the end, Goble's assassinated, and so another lieutenant governor is going to be, taking office instead of him 4 days into his term. It is a remarkable story, and involves all kinds of fascinating twists and turns. So I don't have all the details right in front of me, but I was like stunned as I was reading it. So some of the resources I've posted in that handout will link you to that story, or you can look it up yourselves and consider sharing that with your students as you're talking about some of the tumultuous things going on in the early days of Kentucky after its new constitution in 1891, because it is fascinating stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that. So we can compare states to each other. States all have, differentiated institutions from one another. States make different choices for what the term of office for executive offices is. They make different rules about, which executive officials are elected and which ones are appointed. The term limits are different. Veto powers differ. How they can override vetoes or whether they can override vetoes differs. This is just a few comparisons of a few states just to see some of those. Here's Kentucky. Kentucky had a very interesting one I had not seen before, which was the governor being eligible to be reelected once, but then having to take a term off before being able to run for office again. That's a relatively uncommon in state constitutions. The override of the veto was also pretty fascinating too, that a majority of both houses pass a bill into law. And if the governor vetoes it, a majority of both houses can pass it back into law. That's the override of the veto. So if the governor can't like effectively use the veto and persuade legislators to change their mind, uh, their veto is basically useless. Has that been your experience with, how governing works in Kentucky? That the veto power of the governor is largely ceremonial or statement making, and it doesn't actually stop bills from becoming law? Because I found that quite remarkable. You're not the only state that does that, but yeah. So there's some opportunities to explore what those differences look like from state to state with students. Get them to compare, different lengths of terms or term limits or powers that the governor might have. Do the same thing with the legislature, right? And get them to think about, just ask questions to your students about like, what might be some advantages of having a governor with a 4-year term instead of a 2-year term? What might be an advantage of letting a governor get reelected instead of having him, with no term? What might be an advantage of having a governor have a limit of 2 terms or only 1 term, as opposed to just being able to run over and over and over again forever, right? And get your students start thinking about like what that can mean. It's a really simple exercise. They can do a little bit of basic research using one of those resources like the Book of States, and then just ask them some thought-provoking questions and let them start to share their ideas. And you'll be surprised what they can come up with for what the pros and cons might be, because they'll be pretty accurate. If they say something like, if you have no term limit, that's good because voters can, if they like the governor, they can keep the governor. Like, yeah, that's true, right? What's the disadvantage? Kids can probably come up with things like, somebody might stick around too long and then you don't get new ideas. Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely a disadvantage of the system, right? So et cetera, right? So I hear, Rachel calling for term limits for representatives right now. Talk about that with your students, right? Look up what's the terms and term limits for representatives and ask them about what's the advantages and disadvantages of that, right? You don't have to get super political with it with students. Just, let them speak their minds about what they think the pros and cons are, right? All right. So if you're curious about like what's like super unique to Kentucky, our boss Sean Weinberg is a state constitutions expert, like I said before, and he loves to highlight what he thinks of as the like most unique, quirky things that like a state does that no other state does. That's the stuff he's most drawn to, because it's where you see kind of unique characteristics of a state, like what makes it special, right? What makes how its history kind of stands out from others. So Kentucky's got a few unique features. One is that your legislative sessions are among the shortest in the country. 60 days in even numbered years, 30 days in odd numbered years. There's a few states that do less than that, but that is definitely on the low side. So that's kind of interesting. I found this one pretty interesting, that counties get a lot of wide home rule power, where counties can make a ton of decisions without the state legislature, and largely the state of Kentucky kind of stays out of the business of a lot of what counties do. Cities are so different and are significantly restricted, and the Constitution even has classifications of cities, like class 1, class 2, class 3, down through class 6, and the cities have different levels of powers they're allowed locally depending on which class they're in. I have not seen that in another state constitution, so that's pretty unique, and could be fun to look into the history of why that happened in Kentucky in that 1891 Constitution. And I couldn't help but draw attention to this one. I'm sure many of you already know this one, but the oath of office for all public officials and attorneys in Kentucky includes an anti-dueling oath. Every single public official from governor down through local attorneys must swear, quote, "I have not fought a duel with deadly weapons within this state, nor out of it, nor have I sent or accepted a challenge to fight a duel, nor have I acted as second in carrying a challenge," meaning you're the person who like holds the gun for your friend who's dueling, "nor aided or assisted any person thus offending, so help me God." That is the conclusion. Did you guys know that? How is this new information to anybody, or does like everybody in Kentucky know this? Every
No,
state board. What's that?
yes, Yes, the election board, state textbook commission, every state board I've ever been on has to swear that oath. Yeah, it's part of the oath. It's part of a
Yeah,
bigger oath. That's not the
yeah,
only
yeah,
part of it.
yeah. It's
Yeah,
it's like kind of tail end of the oath of office. Yeah,
yeah.
but totally unique to Kentucky. There is not an anti-dueling oath in any other state in the country. Um, I think there are a couple of other southern states that at one point had these oaths included, but Kentucky's the last one standing on it. So I think you should hang on to that for dear life because that is awesome. I think that's fabulous. So, and the history underlying it is kind of remarkable. The person who ascends to the governorship in that story about the about Governor Goebel who was assassinated, the person who ascends to the governorship is a notorious dueler who you can look up the stories on like who he dueled with and why, and they're fabulous. I need to pull his name up again and look that up here at the end of the session and make sure that you know where to go find his stories. But um, I think it would be just wonderful for you to find all that kind of quirky stuff and just when you're teaching about the progressive era, zoom in on the Kentucky Constitution, talk about the features that make it progressive, and then get into some of those fun quirks about like the history around that time of like these dueling governors and the governor who got assassinated and officials still swearing an oath not to duel, and all that kind of stuff. Like, find the moments to weave it in, right? So, all right. So these are a number of resources. These are on the handout as well, of just ways that you can do more to teach about state and local government. The Kentucky Historical Society has provided you with some solid resources. They've got primary source guides that are aligned to various parts of the state standards, grade level by grade level. And I think stronger than that, they've got these educator packets where they take specific resources and they have a few kind of like student inquiry activities that go through that resource to try to see like what can you learn about the history from looking at this one source. Okay. Including a photograph of the state capitol not long after the assassination of Goebel. So that's one of the educator packets they have on that website. I mentioned Book of the States earlier. It's just a huge database of tables comparing basic facts about government structure and other features of all 50 states. So if you need to know something about Kentucky and you don't know, what the correct answer is, that's a great source to go to and just see like, line by line, like what does it say about, Kentucky on each category, right? The Kentucky League of Cities built an elementary curriculum on city government, and it's really well done, and it's got beautiful animation and graphics to it, very elementary school friendly, and it goes through like all of what your cities do compared to what your state and your federal government do, and I think that's a fabulous resource. Highly recommend you click on that link and check that one out. Docs Teach is a great national primary source resource. And I just did a quick exercise where I went to Docs Teach and I just searched the word Kentucky to see like, what do I have access to? And got quite a bit, spanning pretty much start to finish of Kentucky's history, of just something I could incorporate as a primary source lesson. Sort of like what the Kentucky Historical Society does. You could kind of borrow their model for an inquiry activity and then find some extra things to use in Docs Teach just from that list, right? Your local PBS station, KET, has a section called Kentucky Studies. There's at least 15 videos I saw there that are like 6 to 20 minutes long about various people and places and eras of history in Kentucky that focus very much on your state, talking about it within the broader national context. So that's certainly a great resource to pull from if you want to find like, where can I just get something to teach about Kentucky? And then for the bigger picture of federalism, I would just love to recommend the resource we've built. If you go to our civic literacy curriculum with that link and then find section 2.5, there's a series of questions that are about federalism from the U.S. citizenship test. And underneath each of those, we have a set of lesson plans designed by teachers from across the country for grades K through 2, grades 3 through 5, grades 6 through 8, and then high school. So you can browse through that and see if there's any good just solid lessons on like learning about federalism and the powers that states have. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I have for you today. So, if you have other recommendations, you can stick around and share them with the group here. And just keep thinking about how to bring the story of Kentucky into our classrooms more often. And if you have not already joined our mailing list, encourage you to do that because we'll keep, sending alerts out about, new resources we've developed and posted. And so, yeah, there's that. that's everything I have for you today. And it is almost 3 o'clock.
Wow.
So if you have any questions, I will stick around for a moment and just, talk through or hear any good stuff you've got about Kentucky history. And then, yeah. And then Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you. Other than
That's
that,
awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you so, so much. I'm gonna pump the evaluation link in so you all can take advantage of that. Please make sure to record your thoughts, and thank you, Jeff. That was fascinating. So much information, so much good information that we can take back and use. As always, as always. I think this is it. Yeah. Well, I thought it was it. Hold on.
okay.
I did it once, but now I've got to do it. It
Yeah.
was blue when I hit send,
Yeah.
and it's blue now. It doesn't like me.
Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you all. Appreciate your gratitude. It's great to be with you all again. Thanks for
Yeah,
joining.
thank you so much. That was great. I'm going to stop recording.